Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. 3.20 buffed a number of mechanics on the Atlas, and the Atlas passive support for all 10 of the blockable mechanics was improved in some way. This is a series where we're looking at all of them, and we're going to be looking at Harvest today because that's the one that viewers requested in a poll that I ran. Now, it's first worth saying that Harvest is actually pretty strong just to run without any Atlas passive support. Not necessarily going to be worth your while if you're running super juiced maps, but if you are running maps that are low investment, you'll find that the Harvest encounters that spawn are definitely worth your while running. This is because there is absolutely insatiable demand for yellow Harvest goo specifically. Now, this will be one of the shorter videos in this series because Harvest nodes are uncomplicated. Most of them simply multiply your loot rather than changing the way that the encounters work in a dramatic way. You're also going to need to connect all of these nodes together. The way that I've demonstrated here has 28 travel points, including one that's actually a notable, Mad Devotion. That's a travel point though for our strategy. And this then takes all 27 of the Harvest points with the exception of the 3 you don't want to take, Vivid Drought and the 2 prerequisite notes. Every cluster is essentially 15 to 20% more multiplier to the loot that you get, and they all stack together, so it's pretty good to take them all. Now, there's a couple of things that need to be said before we get into breaking down the various clusters. Firstly, Harvest scales a bit less than you might think with level. The main reward that you get for being in tier 16 maps with Harvest is that you have more chance of encountering the tier 4 bosses, but they're not very important. So a quick recap on how Harvest plots work. When you encounter a plot, there will be a number of monsters there that will spawn when you set it off, and you will know before you set it off whether you're going to get a tier 4 monster or not. Seems like it's about a 1% chance to get a tier 4. Then you'll have 3 chances to get tier 3 monsters. Tier 3 monsters are very lucrative, and they're actually where most of your wealth will come from when you're doing Harvest. It appears that it's a 25% chance, independent for each of the 3 of them. Then you'll have 8 nodes that can be tier 2 monsters. These seem to have a 75% chance of being tier 2, so every proc that you didn't hit there is going to be replaced by a tier 1 monster. Tier 1 Harvest monsters aren't really worth killing, they drop almost no life force, but they are filler and you kind of got to do them because, well, they're in the way. Tier 2 monsters are okay. When you kill them, they occasionally drop about 15 life force. Tier 3 monsters drop about 45 life force base, and Tier 4 monsters drop somewhere around 250, although because they're so rare, it's hard to pin that down tightly. Now, testing last September, and I don't know if this has changed since then, indicated that quantity on the map applies to the Harvest monsters at half effectiveness. So if you've got 120% quantity on your map, then you should get about 60% increased quantity of life force from it. Pack size effects appear to scale the number of monsters at full effectiveness, and increased item quantity from Eldritch Altars also scales these Harvest drops. However, it appears that Delirium-induced quantity does not. It's actually kind of hard to force Harvest onto maps. There are 2 ways you can get a 100% chance. The first one is maps that have the implicit area contains a Sacred Grove. These are actually pretty rare. These get sold by Kirac sometimes, and they also drop if you take the Shadow Shaping node on the passive tree for the Atlas, but they're pretty rare, and they're not a reliable source by any means. More reliable, at least if you're in Trade League, you can use Charged Compasses, i.e. sealed sextants, that have your maps contain the Sacred Grove. Broadly speaking, these cost about 18 chaos per charge at the time that I'm recording this video, although that can oscillate a little bit with time. Harvest goo is in very high demand, especially the yellow goo. The yellow goo in trade leagues is really demanded for the craft that causes maps not to consume sextants when run. So this is ridiculous if you have min-max sextants on your Atlas, and it's something that a lot of players try to run on every single map that they run. There's not a huge number of players doing this, but they're enough to have a tremendous drain on the amount of yellow life force in the trade league economy, and to mean that you always want yellow life force whenever you've got the flexibility of choosing. Red and blue do have their uses as well, but broadly speaking, the yellow life force is worth about 215% as much as the red or the blue is at the time I'm recording this video. But of course, if you're in solo self-found, you might need to use a specific craft. If you're trying to save red life force for a specific craft, there is absolutely nothing wrong with taking Vivid Drought for a little while, but once you've got that, probably unspec these nodes, because yellow life force is the one that has the most enduring use if you can stack an enormous amount of it, because you might decide at some point that you want to swap into that sort of sextant setup yourself, even in solo self-found. Alright, that's all the basics. Let's go through the inner southeast cluster. This is very simple. Call of the Grove. Increased chance to get the Sacred Grove, 15%. And the 3 small nodes duplicate that, but spread over 3 more points. So, if you have Wandering Path, this cluster gives you 30% increased chance to have the Sacred Grove. If you don't have Wandering Path, this gives you 30% increased chance to have the Sacred Grove. Pretty simple stuff, very good, very important, and the first thing you should take. If you're only taking one harvest cluster, it should be Call of the Grove, but if you are taking one, then all of the rest will become more appealing than they currently are. Okay, so the next cluster we want to look at is the pincers. This is a pretty simple one as well. Bumper crop, Sacred Grove in your maps has 50% chance to contain an additional harvest. Overall, this ends up being about a 15% more multiplier to the number of harvest encounters you'll find every time you get the Sacred Grove. You definitely want to take this node. It's not one of those absolutely essential, can't miss this nodes, but it is very, very good value for the number of points it costs. Bountiful Harvest is next. Harvested plants in your maps have a 10% chance to spawn an additional monster. It is essentially 10% pack size that only applies for harvests. This is really good. It's definitely something you want to take. Also, all the small nodes here are good as well. You have duplicated monsters, you have chance to get the Sacred Grove in the first place, and you've got increased quantity of life force. The way I think about this pincers cluster is that this is 4 more multipliers all working together. 15% more patches, 9% increased life force, 16% increased monsters. Everything about this cluster is good. You definitely want to take it. It's a loot multiplier. It's not as essential as some of the others, but it is very, very good, and it's one of those things that is a pull to doing harvest in general. Next cluster is the Inner East Doubling Season cluster. Life Force dropped by harvest monsters in your maps has 10% chance to be duplicated. This one doesn't really take any thought, it's amazing. And you have a 9% increased multiplier to your loot here as well from the small nodes. This cluster is very good without Wandering Path and only slightly weaker if you do take Wandering Path. Next we have what I term the agency nodes. Now, you're definitely going to want to come down here on pretty much any harvest setup. Firstly, you get 5% increased chance to contain the Sacred Grove. Now, you've got 40% of this stat on the rest of your atlas. This takes you up to 45%. I believe the baseline chance to be 8%. I'm not absolutely certain of that. And it can be scaled up further through the use of content blocks on other content you're not interested in doing. But this stat is very important in terms of getting you a lot of life force. It makes those sextants we were talking about much less appealing, but it is still very, very good when you've got it. Then these nodes have a 45% chance in total. So there's the 2 small nodes that are 10% plus 25% on the big node, 45% reduced chance to grow purple plants, 45% reduced to grow blue plants, and you definitely don't want to take the yellow one. Now, this is going to bias you in favor of yellow plants. It's worth noting that you have the option of choosing between 2 crops at each point. And from a trade league perspective, you're going to want to keep in mind that a yellow crop is worth 2 and a bit times what it would be if it were red or blue, if it were purple or blue. For example, if you have a choice between one option which is 2 of the tier 3 blue monsters and one option which is 1 of the tier 3 yellow monsters, you're going to want to take the 1 tier 3 yellow monster because it's going to give you more loot in general. Anyways, I've run the numbers on these. They work out to be about a 12.5% more multiplier to the total amount of value that you get from your harvests, and that's assuming that you take Wild Drought and Primal Drought, and of course you don't take Vivid Drought at all. Finally, we have the Northern Heart of the Grove cluster. This is one of the most interesting ones because the small nodes are amazing, and in a lot of ways they actually outshine the large node. So in previous incarnations of Harvest, tier 4 plants were much more important than they are now. Tier 4 plants now are basically like getting 4 or 5 tier 3 plants. But they're so rare that increasing the chance by 60% is actually not all that significant. When they say 60% increased chance, this just means that it goes from 1% suspected to 1.6% suspected. And that's not all that much when all you get for killing one of these is a couple hundred life force, plus about a 1 in 10 chance to get yourself a Sacred Blossom. It's just not anything spectacular. However, the other line on this is quite good. Harvests in your map have a 10% chance for the unchosen crop not to wilt. This is not as good as a 10% more multiplier to the amount of harvest encounters that you face, but it is still pretty good. I'd probably estimate this is about a 7% more multiplier to your loot overall, which is fine, and you definitely want to take it. But we have the big thing here, and that's the small nodes. Harvest crops in your maps have 10% increased chance to contain tier 3 plants, and you get 3 of these, so this is a total of 30% increase. Now, the way I suspect this works, and I cannot back this up with absolute proof, but there has been a bit of testing that seems to back this up. It appears that the base chance to get a tier 3 plant is 25%. So if we think of it as a weighting of 10 to get a tier 3 plant and a weighting of 30 to not get a tier 3 plant, then taking all 3 of these nodes increases that weighting of 10 up to a weighting of 13. This means that instead of being 10 in 40, you're 13 in 43. This is not as good as a straight 30% more multiplier to the amount of tier 3 plants you get, and it seems like it's something like a 21% more multiplier to the amount of tier 3 plants you get. That said, that is still absolutely fantastic. Now, if you do go with a Wandering Path Atlas, this stat will be doubled, and in that situation, the diminishing returns kick in a little bit harsher. That said, these nodes are meaningfully better on a Wandering Path Atlas. So that's all the core clusters. You'll notice how they all do pretty much the same thing. They just increase the amount of loot that you get per harvest that you run. Finally, I want to turn to the nodes that transform the mechanics of the entire Atlas. Growing Hordes is the first one I want to talk about, and this thing seems to be really good. If the current assumptions of how pack size works are indeed correct, and these were tested in September of last year, so there may have been some changes since then, but it does seem like map pack size is a more multiplier to the amount of loot that you get out of Harvest, and as a result, Growing Hordes is really good if it fits with the rest of your Atlas. You generally will probably want to use it in conjunction with Rusted Scarabs for the best value here, and you want to use it in conjunction with the Scarabs no one wants. So things like Torment Scarabs, things like Shaper and Elder Scarabs, those are really good to feed to Growing Hordes. Finally, we have Wandering Path. Wandering Path overall is about neutral on a harvest package. The time you might want to consider this is if you want to take the super rippy approach of taking the entirety of the nodes that increase map modifier effect. This requires an extremely powerful character. I know that my character in Sanctum is not capable of handling this, but when you've got 60% increased effect of modifiers on your non-unique maps, this gives you a huge boost to quantity and also to pack size on those maps. That's because each of those individual modifiers is providing some quantity and some pack size. That all gets totaled up and gets multiplied by 1.6 if you take all of these nodes. If you are intending to go this super rippy route, then yes, I would endorse taking Wandering Path. I think you will find that you get paid off for it. However, if you are not playing a character that is capable of doing that super rippy Atlas setup, then in that situation, I would say Wandering Path is more dubious. It is okay. It does give you some rewards. It will make these specific nodes better, but you're going to be paying a big price for it. You're going to miss out on things like Bumper Crop, Bountiful Harvest, but probably most importantly, Doubling Season, and this section of the Atlas is going to be worse as well. That said, a Wandering Path Atlas gets 60% increased chance to get the Sacred Grove from the tree, so you lose out on this node, but all of the 5% nodes go from 5% to 10%. You end up with 60% from the tree and 8% baseline. You're looking at 2 in 3 chance to get one, and that's really, really good, especially if you're running a map like Atoll, where the 32% of the time it's not there, you can pretty quickly tell that, and you can just leave and go on to the next map. That's the summary of Harvest. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away down below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.